She had a price on her head, though not the kind that made her valuable. $17,000. That was the debt her father accumulated through bad investments and worse decisions, and when he could not pay it, he made the only choice a desperate man could make. He sold his youngest daughter to settle the account. Her name was Claire Hartwell, and on the morning everything changed, she stood in her father's study with her hands folded so tightly her nails cut crescents into her palms. The study smelled of leather and whiskey, and the particular staleness of a room where important men made important decisions that would ruin ordinary people. Her father sat behind his mahogany desk, the desk that had belonged to his father and his father before him. The desk that would never belong to Claire because she was a woman and women did not inherit desks or money or the right to make choices about their own futures. Across from him sat Mr. Harrison Thorne, and he was not what Claire expected. She had imagined a money lender as something hard and cruel, a man with a face like carved stone and eyes like slate. Mr. Thorne was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of lines around his eyes that suggested he had spent considerable time squinting into difficult situations. He wore a suit that had been expensive once but was now worn at the cuffs. His hands, when he gestured, were steady and strong, the hands of a man who had worked for his wealth rather than inherited it. "Your daughter will clear the debt, Mr. Thorne said. His voice was quiet, measured, the way a man speaks when he has already made up his mind and is simply waiting for others to catch up to his conclusion. "She will come to my estate in Montana. She will work for 1 year. At the end of that year the debt is paid in full. No interest, no extensions. 1 year and your family is free of obligation." Claire's father nodded slowly, but his jaw was tight. The debt was the reason their house had begun to crumble around them. The reason the servants had been dismissed one by one until only the cook remained. The reason her mother had taken to her bed 3 months ago and had not come down since. The reason Claire's prospects had shrunk from marriage to a respectable man to this. To being sold like a horse at auction, valued at $17,000 of her father's carelessness. "You understand, Mr. Hartwell said carefully, that my daughter has no experience with the kind of work you might require. She was raised to manage a household, not to labor within one." Mr. Thorne's eyes shifted to Claire. She was standing near the door, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the wood paneling and the shadows. His gaze was steady, assessing, but not unkind. "I am not looking for labor," Mr. Thorne said. "I am looking for someone to organize my household, to manage my staff, to bring order to my home. My estate has been without a woman's direction for many years. It has suffered for it. Your daughter looks intelligent. That will suffice." Claire felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was a dangerous thing, a thing that made you believe tomorrow might be different from today, and tomorrow was always exactly the same. But something in her had moved. Some small part of her that had calcified over the past months began to soften. She was not being sold into slavery. She was being sent away to work, yes, but the work sounded almost reasonable. Almost like something she might be capable of doing. "She will need to leave within the week," Mr. Thorne continued. "The journey to Montana is long. The weather will not remain favorable much longer. I have arranged for a private car on the westbound train. She will be comfortable during travel." Her father looked at Claire for the first time since Mr. Thorne had arrived. His eyes were hollowed out, emptied by shame and fear, and the terrible clarity that comes from understanding you have destroyed your own family. She saw him trying to find something to say, some fatherly wisdom or reassurance, but there were no words adequate to the occasion. What could he say? That he was sorry, that she should forgive him, that everything would be all right. All of those things would be lies, and lies were beneath the dignity of this moment. "I will take good care of her," Mr. Thorne said, and the words sounded like a promise, the kind a man makes when he knows he is asking another man to trust him with something precious. By the next morning the entire household knew. By evening, the entire town knew. Claire was walking through the market near the cathedral when she saw the faces shift, the knowing looks pass between women, the whispered conversations that stopped when she came near. She had become a story before she became an exile. She had become a cautionary tale, a lesson, a scandal that would occupy conversations for months once she was gone. The poor Hartwell girl, they would say, sold to pay her father's debts. What a thing, what a shame, what a downfall. The Hartwell name had meant something once. Not wealthy, not like the Vanderbilts or the Carnegies, but respectable, solid. Her grandfather had been a banker. Her father had attended university. Her mother's family had produced a judge and a politician. And then in the space of 5 years, her father had lost everything, had made decisions so phenomenally bad that they had managed to destroy not just his own future but his daughter's as well. Claire had always understood that she would be married off. That was the expected trajectory for girls like her. But she had imagined it would be to someone in her own circle, someone her parents approved of, someone she might have at least met at a social gathering before being joined to him for life. She had never imagined it would be like this. Like selling an animal, like settling a debt with livestock. The week before her departure, Claire packed her trunks with help from her mother's lady's maid, an older woman named Margaret who had been with the family since before Claire was born. Margaret worked in silence, folding Claire's dresses carefully, arranging them with tissue paper between the layers to prevent wrinkles. She selected Claire's best things, the traveling suit, the day dresses, the evening gown she had worn only once, to a Christmas party 2 years ago before everything began to unravel. She packed the jewelry that Claire had been allowed to keep, small things, nothing of real value. She packed the leather journal where Claire had written her thoughts since she was 14 years old. She packed Claire's mother's shawl, the one she had wrapped around her shoulders when she withdrew from the world and rarely left her room. "You are very brave, Miss Claire," Margaret said as she folded the last dress. She was an older woman, with the kind of lined face that comes from decades of quiet work and careful observation. "I do not feel brave," Claire said. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, watching Margaret work. "I feel like I am drowning." Margaret paused. Her hands, which had been so efficiently folding, stilled for a moment. "Bravery is not the absence of fear," she said. "Bravery is doing what must be done even when you are afraid. You are doing what must be done. That makes you brave, whether you feel it or not." The words were kind, but they did not ease the tightness in Claire's chest. When you did what must be done, when you had no choice at all, could it really be called bravery? Or was it simply the machinery of survival, the way an animal survives because it must, not because it chooses to? The morning of her departure, Claire stood in the entrance hall of her childhood home wearing her traveling suit and holding her gloves in her hands. The suit was navy blue, practical, designed for the dust and motion of train travel. Her hair had been styled by Margaret, arranged in careful waves and pinned with the tortoiseshell comb that had belonged to her grandmother. She had been made beautiful, or as beautiful as could be managed under the circumstances. She had been made presentable, made into a commodity that would not embarrass Mr. Thorne or reflect poorly on her family's name. Her father stood across from her, and he looked worse than he had that day in the study with Mr. Thorne. He had aged visibly in the past week. His hair seemed grayer. His shoulders seemed narrower. He was a man who had been diminished by his own failures, and there was a kind of horror in watching him understand that he had nothing left to lose because he had already lost everything. "You will write," he said. It was not a request. It was a desperate command from a man who had no authority left to command anything. "Yes, Father," Claire said. "You will conduct yourself with dignity. Yes, Father, you will remember your upbringing. You will remember that you are a Hartwell, and the Hartwell name, despite everything, still carries weight." Claire wanted to ask him where that weight was now. She wanted to ask him if it had protected her, if it had prevented this moment. But she said nothing. She simply nodded. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was uncertain, as if he was afraid she might pull away, as if she would deny him even this last small gesture. She did not pull away. She allowed him to hold her hand, and after a moment he pulled her forward and embraced her. It was an awkward gesture, stiff, the embrace of a man who was not practiced at showing affection, but it was all he had to give her. She stood within the circle of his arms and felt the tremor that ran through him, and she understood that he was crying, though he made no sound. The car arrived at 10 o'clock. It was a hired conveyance, well-maintained, with a driver who did not acknowledge Claire's presence in any meaningful way. He simply loaded her trunks, helped her into the vehicle with a gloved hand, and took his seat on the bench. Claire watched her father from the window as the car pulled away from the house. He stood in the doorway, a smaller man than he had been before all of this, and she thought about how quickly a life could collapse. How you could wake up one morning with everything in the world and go to bed that night with nothing at all. The train station was crowded with the usual morning chaos. People moving in all directions, porters calling out destinations, the sound of trains arriving and departing, the smell of coal and steam, and the particular mustiness of a building where thousands of people had passed through. Mr. Thorne was waiting on the platform, and Claire recognized him immediately, though she had seen him only that one time in her father's study. He was dressed for travel as well, in a suit and a hat, and he looked more solid in person than her memory had retained. More real, more like a man and less like a symbol of her own downfall. "Miss Hartwell," he said, approaching her with a small formal bow, "I trust your journey was not too arduous." "It was not, sir. The car was comfortable." "Good. We will be boarding in 15 minutes. My staff has already arranged for your trunks to be loaded into the baggage car. You will find your compartment has been prepared to your comfort. There are reading materials, refreshments, anything you might require during travel." Claire nodded. She was watching the way he moved, the way he spoke, trying to discern what kind of man he was beneath the formality. But he was difficult to read. He was polite in the way that men of a certain class are taught to be polite, but there was no warmth in it, no particular interest in her as a person. She was a solution to a problem, a woman to manage his household, the same way one might hire a cook to manage the kitchen. She had been purchased, but she had not been chosen. There was a difference, though she suspected it was a small one. The train compartment was larger than Claire had expected. There was a seating area with upholstered chairs, a bed that folded up into the wall, a small writing desk, and a window that looked out onto the platform. There were flowers in a vase, fresh flowers, which seemed like an unnecessary kindness. There were books stacked on a small table, novels mostly, and some volumes of poetry. There were fresh berries and bread and cheese arranged on a plate, and a carafe of water and a bottle of wine. It was, in its way, lovely. It was the kind of consideration that someone of means might extend to someone they cared for. But it was extended here to someone they had purchased, someone they did not know, someone who was being transported across the country to work in a home she had never seen. Claire sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to cry. She cried quietly, carefully, aware that sound carries easily through train walls, and she did not want anyone to know she was afraid. She cried because she was leaving everything she had ever known. She cried because her life had become something unrecognizable. She cried because no one had asked her what she wanted, and she was not sure anymore that she knew what she wanted. She cried because she was 19 years old and her entire future had been decided without her consent, and there was nothing she could do about it. When the tears stopped, she washed her face with the cool water from the carafe and looked at herself in the small mirror above the desk. Her eyes were red, but the redness would fade. Her face was blotchy, but it would return to its normal color. She would compose herself. She would do what she had always done, which was to endure, to accept, to move forward even when moving forward seemed like the wrong direction. She would survive this. That was what women did. That was the entire training of her girlhood condensed into a single imperative: survive, endure, do not make trouble. The train began to move, and Claire felt the particular lurch that marks the beginning of a journey. They rolled slowly out of the station, gathering speed as the buildings and streets began to fall away. She watched the city of her birth recede into the distance, and she thought about how you never know the last time you will see something until it is already gone. She had lived in that house for 19 years. She had played in those gardens. She had walked those streets. She had never imagined that one day she would leave and never return. And yet here she was, on a train heading west, toward a man she did not know and a place she had never seen, and the only thing she was certain of was that she could not go back. The train traveled for 3 days and 3 nights. Claire spent her time reading the books that had been provided, staring out the window at the landscape as it changed, eating small meals in her compartment. Mr. Thorne had his own compartment, and he did not intrude on her privacy. They saw each other only briefly at mealtimes when they would share a dining car with other first-class passengers. The conversations were polite, formal, superficial. They spoke about the weather. They spoke about the landscape. They did not speak about what she would find when they arrived. They did not speak about the terms of her service. They did not speak about anything that mattered. On the third night, as the train moved through the mountains, Claire stood on the observation platform at the end of the last car. The night was cold, and the air was thin in a way that made her feel like she was breathing in something that was not quite air. The stars were bright, brighter than they had ever been in the city. There were so many of them, so many more than she had ever imagined existed. They stretched across the sky like someone had spilled diamonds, and they had scattered in all directions. "You should not be out here alone, Mr. Thorne's voice came from behind her. She had not heard him approach. "I wanted to see the stars," Claire said. "In the city, there are never enough stars to see." He stepped up beside her, and they stood in silence for a moment, looking up at the night sky. He was close enough that she could have touched his arm if she had wanted to. But she did not want to. She held her arms wrapped around herself, trying to preserve warmth, trying to maintain the boundaries between her body and his. "When I was a young man," Mr. Thorne said quietly, "I spent a year working in the mountains. I was a surveyor, mapping land that was being opened up for settlement. I remember the first night I slept under these stars, and I remember thinking that all the trials of my life up to that point had been worth it, just to see them." Claire glanced at him. He was looking up at the sky, and his face looked different than it had in the daylight, softer, older, like he was carrying a weight that was only visible in certain kinds of light. "Do you still live in the mountains?" she asked. "My estate is in a valley in Montana," Mr. Thorne said. "It is a wild place still, though civilization is slowly creeping in. Towns are being built, railways are being laid, but where I live there is still wildness, still space. Still sky like this, untouched and infinite. It sounds beautiful. It is beautiful," he said. "It is also lonely. That is why I brought you here. To bring a woman's touch to a house that has been without one for too long. To bring some softness to a place that has become too hard." Claire was not sure how to respond to this. It was the most personal thing he had said to her since they had met. It was also the most disturbing, because it suggested that he had expectations of her beyond simple household management. She wanted to ask him what he meant. She wanted to ask if he intended for her to be more than an employee. But fear kept her silent. Fear and the understanding that she had no real leverage, no real ability to refuse anything. She had been sold. She belonged to him for the next year, and what happened during that year was his to decide. "You should return to your compartment," Mr. Thorne said. "The platform is not safe. The train is moving and the night is cold. You will take ill." "Yes, sir," Claire said, and she left him there, standing under the stars, looking at something that might have been the infinite sky or might have been the infinite disappointment of his own life. She never saw him standing still like that, looking like he was listening for something that was just beyond the reach of his hearing. The train arrived in Montana on the morning of the 4th day. The landscape had changed completely from what Claire had known on the eastern seaboard. There were mountains here, real mountains, not the gentle hills she was accustomed to, but massive formations of rock and snow that seemed to touch the sky. There were vast plains that stretched for what seemed like forever, empty, except for scattered ranch buildings and herds of cattle or horses or animals she could not immediately identify. It was beautiful in a way that was almost alien to her, beautiful in the way that something terrifying can be beautiful. It was too big. It was too empty. It was the kind of landscape where a person could lose themselves completely and no one would notice. Mr. Thorne's carriage was waiting at the station. It was a fine vehicle, well-maintained, drawn by two matched gray horses. The driver was a man of perhaps 60 years, with weathered skin and the kind of quiet competence that came from decades of reliable work. He helped Claire into the carriage without saying anything to her, and Mr. Thorne climbed in beside her. The carriage began to move, and Claire watched the town recede as they drove away from civilization and into the open land. The drive to the estate took several hours. During that time, Mr. Thorne pointed out various landmarks. That peak is called Eagle Head because the rock formation at its top resembles a bird in flight. That valley is where most of the cattle graze during the summer months. That river provides water for the whole operation during the dry season. He spoke as if he was offering her a tour of a museum, presenting information in the voice of someone who was executing a prescribed script. He was not being unkind, but he was not being particularly warm either. He was simply providing information that he seemed to believe would be useful for her to know. The estate appeared suddenly, around a bend in the road, and Claire was not prepared for the sight of it. She had imagined a house, perhaps a large one, perhaps something impressive. But what she saw was more than that. It was a mansion, built from pale stone, with towers at the corners and windows that caught the light. It sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, and it looked like something that should not exist in this wild place. It looked like someone had taken a palace from Europe and placed it down in the middle of America, where it looked simultaneously magnificent and utterly out of place. "This is your home now," Mr. Thorne said. "For the next year at least, this is where you will live." The carriage pulled up the long drive and stopped in front of the main entrance. There was a wide stone staircase leading up to heavy wooden doors, and beside the doors stood a woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in black, with her gray hair pinned severely back from her face. Her name was Mrs. Whitmore, and she was, as Mr. Thorne explained, the head of his household staff. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Miss Hartwell. She will be managing the household going forward. She will have authority over the staff, and I expect her decisions to be respected." Mrs. Whitmore's face did not change. She simply nodded once, a gesture that suggested she had understood her instructions and would comply with them, though she was not pleased. It was, in fact, a look that Claire would come to know very well in the coming months. The look of a woman who had held a certain position of authority and now found that position being taken away by a newcomer. A young woman who was not qualified, who was not trained, who had simply been brought here by her employer as if she were a prize to be displayed. "I will leave you to settle in," Mr. Thorne said to Claire. "Mrs. Whitmore will show you to your rooms. We will take dinner together at 8 o'clock. You should be rested by then." "Yes, sir," Claire said. She followed Mrs. Whitmore up the grand staircase, and as she climbed, she could feel the weight of the older woman's resentment. It was a tangible thing, a presence in the space between them. By the time they reached the top of the stairs, Claire was not surprised to find that the rooms she was being shown to were among the most beautiful in the house, or that the location of them, in a private corridor away from the main guest rooms, suggested something about the nature of her position. "These are your rooms, Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Whitmore said. "A sitting room, a bedroom, and a dressing room. The staff have been instructed to attend to your needs. Dinner is at 8 o'clock. Breakfast at 7, luncheon at 12:30. Is there anything you require?" "This is lovely," Claire said, though she was not sure it was. The rooms were beautifully appointed, decorated in rich colors and fine furniture, but they felt isolated. They felt like the rooms of someone who was not entirely part of the household, someone who was separate, someone who did not quite belong. "Good," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Then I shall leave you to settle. Someone will bring your trunks momentarily." After the older woman had gone, Claire walked around the rooms, trying to understand what space she had been given in this house, in this life. The sitting room looked out onto the valley, and from the window she could see the mountains and the sky and the vast emptiness of the landscape. The bedroom was dominated by a large four-poster bed with heavy curtains. The dressing room was filled with built-in closets and a large mirror and all the accoutrements of a woman's toilette. It was all very fine. It was all very carefully arranged to present an image of privilege and position. And yet she felt like a doll that had been placed in a dollhouse, beautiful and useless, and utterly without agency. She did not unpack her trunks when they arrived. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the light change as the day moved toward evening. She thought about her life in the city, which now seemed to belong to someone else, someone who had lived 1,000 years ago. She thought about her mother, who was still in her bed, probably still in her bed, hidden away from a world that had disappointed her profoundly. She thought about her father, who had sold his daughter to pay a debt, and she tried to muster some anger at him, but all she could feel was a tired sadness. He had done what he thought he had to do. That did not make it better. It did not make it right. But it made it understandable, in the way that many terrible things are understandable when you examine them closely enough. At 7:30, a knock came on the door. It was a young maid, a girl perhaps 17 or 18, who introduced herself as Lily and informed Claire that her bath was ready, and she had laid out a dress for dinner. Lily was nervous, uncertain, and Claire realized with a start that the girl was nervous of her. That despite knowing nothing about Claire, despite having no reason to regard her as anything other than the latest whim of an employer, the girl treated her with deference, with respect, with the understanding that Claire now held some position of authority in this household. It was a strange feeling, being feared, being treated as someone important. Claire, who had never been important to anyone, who had been something of a burden to her own family, was now being treated as someone who mattered. And she was not sure what to do with that knowledge. The dress that Lily had laid out was one of Claire's finest, a deep emerald green that brought out the color of her eyes. Lily helped her into it, and her fingers were quick and skillful as she fastened the hooks down the back. Then Lily arranged her hair, taking the long dark waves and pinning them up in a style that was elegant and appropriate for dinner. When she was finished, Claire looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The girl looking back at her looked older, more confident, more like someone who belonged in a fine house. She looked, in fact, exactly like someone who had not just been sold to pay her father's debt. She looked like a woman of some standing. Mr. Thorne was waiting for her in the dining room. The table was impossibly long, set with white damask and fine china and silver that caught the light. Mr. Thorne was standing at the head of the table, and he stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that was almost shocking in its courtesy. He seated her at a position of honor to his right, and then he sat down, and dinner was served. It was an odd meal, formal and strained. Servants moved silently around the room, providing each course, clearing plates. Mr. Thorne made polite conversation about the journey, about the estate, about the weather that was expected in the coming months. Claire responded when she was spoken to, but she said little of her own initiative. She was still trying to understand the rules of this new world she had been thrust into. She was still trying to understand what was expected of her. After dinner, Mr. Thorne invited her to his study. It was a masculine room, lined with books, dominated by a large fireplace with a fire burning in it. There were leather chairs arranged near the fire, and Mr. Thorne gestured for Claire to sit in one of them while he sat in the other. "I should explain the nature of your position more clearly," he said. "You will be responsible for the management of this household. You will direct the staff, oversee the accounts, ensure that everything runs smoothly. Mrs. Whitmore will assist you, though she may resist the arrangement initially. It is important that you establish your authority firmly from the beginning. If you do not, she will undermine you at every turn." Claire nodded. This much had been suggested before. "You will also take on a role as my hostess when guests arrive. I entertain occasionally, though not as often as I once did. When there are gatherings, you will sit at the foot of the table, manage the flow of the meal, ensure that all guests are comfortable. You will be, in essence, the lady of this house." The last phrase hung in the air between them, and Claire understood that it carried weight, that it meant more than simply managing a household. She wanted to ask him what exactly he was asking her to be. She wanted to ask if the terms of their arrangement extended beyond the simple work she could see and into something more intimate, something more complicated. But fear prevented her from asking. Fear and the understanding that answers might not be the ones she wanted to hear. "I expect you to be discreet," he said quietly. "What happens in this house should not become the subject of speculation in town. My private affairs are my own, and by extension, they are your own as well. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Claire said, though she understood nothing. She understood only that she was being warned about something, being told to keep secrets about something, but she did not know what the secret was or what she was being warned against. "Good," he said. "Then I think we have an understanding." He stood, and she understood that the interview was over. She rose as well, and he walked her to the door of the study. As she was leaving, he said, "You will do well here, Miss Hartwell. I am confident of that. You have intelligence and composure and a certain strength that I did not expect. My life is complicated. This household is complicated. But you strike me as the sort of woman who can manage complications." "Thank you, sir," Claire said. And she left him there, standing in the doorway of his study. And she made her way back to her rooms. And she finally allowed herself to begin to wonder what she had actually gotten herself into. The next morning, Claire woke before dawn. The habit of a lifetime, rising early, was not something that was easily broken, even in a strange place. The sun had not yet come up when she went to the window and looked out at the landscape. The mountains were dark silhouettes against a sky that was beginning to lighten at the edges. She could see down into the valley, where mist hung over the grass like something living, and she could see the outbuildings of the estate, the stables and the cottages where the staff lived, and the long, low structure that she would later learn was used for storage. It was beautiful, this place. It was also completely foreign to everything she had ever known. Back east, the world was ordered, organized, divided into neat social strata where everyone knew their place. Here, looking out at this landscape, Claire could imagine that the normal rules did not apply, that people could be who they wanted to be, that the past could be left behind. It was, she realized, a dangerous thought. Because if she started to believe that kind of thing, she might start to believe that her life could be different, that her circumstances could change, that she might actually have a future that was not predetermined. She dressed in one of her simpler day dresses and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, the staff not yet beginning their work. She found her way to the kitchen, where an older woman was already working, preparing ingredients for the day's meals. The woman looked up when Claire entered, and her expression was immediately guarded. "I'm sorry, ma'am. If you wanted breakfast, I can have it brought to the dining room." "No, I wanted to speak with you," Claire said. "You are the cook." "Yes, ma'am." "Margaret, ma'am. Margaret, I am going to be managing this household, and I wanted to introduce myself properly. To all the staff, actually. I understand this may be an adjustment. I am not here to change things unnecessarily. But I am here, and I will need your cooperation and your respect." Margaret looked at her carefully, as if she was trying to determine whether Claire was serious or whether she was playing some kind of game. "Yes, ma'am," Margaret said finally. "What would you like to do?" "I would like to understand how this household operates. I would like to meet all of the staff and understand their responsibilities. I would like to learn about the menus and the supplies and the systems that are in place. I want to understand everything so that I can do this job properly." Margaret seemed to relax slightly. Respect was something she understood. Hard work was something she understood. The desire to do a job properly was something she could respect. "Well then, ma'am, if you'd like, I can introduce you to the others. They should be starting work soon." By mid-morning, Claire had met every member of the staff. There were the kitchen workers, including Margaret and two younger women who assisted her. There were the housemaids, including Lily and four others who moved through the house with practiced efficiency, dusting and sweeping and polishing. There was the groundskeeper and his assistant. There was the stable master and the stable hands. There was Mr. Graves, the butler, who was tall and thin, and carried himself with an air of authority that suggested he had been with Mr. Thorne for a long time. And there was Mrs. Whitmore, who watched everything with an expression that suggested she was waiting for Claire to fail, waiting for the moment when Claire would reveal herself to be inadequate to the task. By the time Claire had finished these meetings, she had several things that needed to be done immediately. The household accounts were disorganized. The supply orders were being made without any real system, resulting in either overstock or shortages. The menus were repetitive and dull. There were repairs that needed to be made to the nursery wing, which had not been used since Mr. Thorne's wife died. There were curtains that needed to be replaced in the drawing room. There were any number of things that suggested that this house, despite its grandeur, had been sliding into a kind of benign neglect. She threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. She spent her days working alongside the staff, understanding systems, making notes, developing plans. She spent her evenings in the small office that she claimed as her own, working on the accounts, organizing the menus, drawing up lists of repairs and improvements. She was giving herself to this work in a way that she had never given herself to anything. And somewhere in the act of doing, she began to feel something that she had not felt since her father had sold her to pay his debt. She began to feel useful. She began to feel like she might actually be good at something. It was during the third week of her employment that the first significant challenge arrived. Mr. Thorne came to her in the morning room where she was reviewing suppliers' invoices and told her that they would be having guests. Not immediately, but in 2 weeks. A small party of 6 people. Significant people. People whose opinion mattered to him. "I need you to prepare the house," he said. "I need you to prepare yourself. These people will be assessing you, whether either of us acknowledges it or not. They will be wondering about you. Wondering who you are and why I have brought a woman into my home. I need you to be perfect." Claire felt something shift inside her, something that was a combination of anxiety and anger. She had been doing the work. She had been proving her competence. And yet somehow that was not going to be enough. She was going to be judged not on what she could do, but on who she was, on the circumstances that had brought her into his home under circumstances that she could not control and could not explain. She looked up from the invoices, and Mr. Thorne was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. There was something almost apologetic in his eyes, but there was also something resolute. He was not asking her permission. He was informing her of a reality that she would have to navigate. "I understand," Claire said quietly. "Do you?" he asked. "I'm not certain that you do. These people, the Hendersons, the Carlyles, the Ashworths, they are not people who extend grace easily. They are people who have built their lives on the assumption that the world operates according to certain rules. And one of those rules is that women of uncertain origins do not suddenly appear in the homes of wealthy men without explanation." Claire set down her pen carefully. The invoices seemed suddenly unimportant. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Be better than their expectations," he said. "Be so competent, so graceful, so thoroughly in command of this household that they find it impossible to question your presence. Make them see that you belong here. Make them see that bringing you here was a decision made with purpose and forethought." He paused, and in that pause, Claire could see something shifting in him as well. Some internal calculation being made. "And perhaps," he continued, "it would help if you had a story. Not the truth necessarily, not yet, but a story that is plausible, That explains who you are in a way that these people can understand and accept. Claire felt a chill move through her. This was a crossing point. She understood that. If she constructed a false history for herself, she would be stepping into a kind of deception that might be difficult to undo. And yet, what choice did she have? The truth, that her father had sold her to pay his debts, that she had been purchased by a cowboy in a moment of impulse or mercy or something else entirely, was not a story that any of these people would accept. "What kind of story?" she asked. "That," Mr. Thorne said, "is something we need to discuss carefully. I will not ask you to tell lies about your family or your background if you do not wish to, but we might frame things differently. We might emphasize certain truths while being vague about others." Over the next several days, Claire and Mr. Thorne developed what she came to think of as her new history. She was a distant relation of a family that had fallen on difficult times. Her parents had died some years ago. She had lived with relatives in a smaller town to the north, where she had been educated and trained in household management. She had come to Mr. Thorne's employ through a mutual acquaintance who had recommended her for the position. It was vague enough to be unverifiable, yet specific enough to be believable. It provided a framework that would satisfy casual inquiry without forcing her to construct elaborate falsehoods. But preparing a story was only part of what needed to be done. The house itself had to be transformed. The drawing room, which Mr. Thorne had mentioned, needed new curtains. Not just any new curtains, but curtains that would demonstrate taste and refinement. The nursery wing, closed since the death of Mr. Thorne's wife years ago, needed to be opened and prepared, even if it would not be used during the visit. It was important, Mr. Thorne explained, that visitors see a house that was fully alive, not one that was haunted by absence. Claire threw herself into this preparation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She spent long hours with the seamstress, selecting fabrics and discussing patterns. She worked with the painters and the carpenters, overseeing repairs and improvements. She reorganized the kitchens to prepare menus that would demonstrate sophistication without being ostentatious. And in the evenings, she practiced. She practiced walking through the rooms with the correct posture. She practiced greeting visitors with the right balance of warmth and formality. She practiced conversation, anticipating the kinds of questions that might be asked and developing responses that were honest without being revealing. It was Mrs. Whitmore who noticed the transformation first, and her reaction was complex. The housekeeper had been watching Claire with an expression of doubt since the very first day, as if waiting for some fundamental inadequacy to reveal itself. But as the weeks progressed and Claire's competence became increasingly undeniable, something shifted in Mrs. Whitmore's demeanor. It was not quite respect, not yet, but it was something approaching it. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement that Claire was not simply playing at being a household manager, but was actually doing the work with genuine skill and commitment. It was Mrs. Whitmore who pulled Claire aside one afternoon, about a week before the guests were scheduled to arrive. "You've done well," the older woman said. It was said simply, without fanfare, but Claire understood that this was significant. "Better than I expected." "Thank you," Claire replied. "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Whitmore said. "These next few days will be the real test. Mrs. Henderson has a reputation for being exacting. Mrs. Carlyle notices everything. And Mr. Ashworth, well, Mr. Ashworth has known Mr. Thorne for 30 years. He will be watching you very carefully indeed." "To what end?" Claire asked. "To determine whether Mr. Thorne has lost his mind," Mrs. Whitmore said bluntly. "There are people in society who believe that a man's judgment is directly reflected in the women he surrounds himself with. If you are unsuitable, they will see it as a reflection on him. If you are suitable, more than suitable, then it reflects well on him, his wisdom, his discernment." Claire absorbed this information quietly. It added another layer to the weight she was already carrying. The day before the guests were to arrive, Claire found herself unable to sleep. She rose in the darkness before dawn and made her way to the library, thinking that perhaps reading might calm her mind. Instead, she found Mr. Thorne already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs by the window, looking out at the grounds as they gradually emerged from the darkness. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "No," Claire admitted. He gestured to the chair beside his, and she sat down. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the sky gradually lighten from black to deep purple to the first hints of blue. "I want you to know something," Mr. Thorne said finally. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever these people think or say, you have already proven your worth to me. Your competence is not in question, not in my mind." Claire turned to look at him. In the growing light, she could see his face more clearly. There was something in his expression that made her breath catch, something that went beyond professional approval. "Then why does their judgment matter?" she asked. "If your mind is already made, why do we need to convince them?" "Because," he said slowly, "I do not live alone in this world. I exist within a network of social and professional relationships. These people matter to my business interests. They matter to my standing in society. And more than that," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "I do not want you to spend your life under a cloud of suspicion or doubt. I want you to be able to move through society with confidence, knowing that you have been accepted and validated by people who have the power to grant or withhold such acceptance." It was an explanation that went deeper than the surface, and Claire understood that there was something Mr. Thorne was not quite saying. But before she could ask, he rose from his chair. "Come," he said, "let me show you something." He led her through the quiet house to the portrait gallery, a hallway lined with paintings of the Thorne family going back several generations. They walked slowly past stern-faced ancestors and women in elaborate gowns, until they reached a more recent portrait, a woman with Mr. Thorne's dark eyes and a gentle expression. "My wife," he said quietly, "Margaret. This was painted about 5 years before she died." Claire studied the portrait. There was something in the woman's eyes that suggested both strength and kindness. "She was a remarkable woman," Mr. Thorne continued. "She came from a family that society considered acceptable. Her bloodline was impeccable. Her education was thorough. And yet, despite all of that, she was kind to people that society had deemed unworthy of kindness. She believed that a person's value was not determined by their origins, but by their character and their actions." He turned away from the portrait. "When she died, I closed off the nursery wing because the silence of that empty space seemed more bearable than trying to fill it. I closed myself off from society because the pity in people's eyes was unbearable. And I remained closed off for far too long." Claire understood then, or thought she did. Mr. Thorne was not simply preparing for guests. He was preparing to re-enter the world. And in some way, Claire's presence, her competence, her grace under pressure, her willingness to transform herself for the sake of this household, had made that re-entry possible. The morning of the guests' arrival dawned clear and bright. Claire had dressed with meticulous care in a gown of deep blue that had been made for her by the seamstress, a gown that was elegant without being ostentatious, that suggested both competence and refinement. Her hair had been arranged in a simple but sophisticated style. She had practiced her greeting 100 times. The carriage arrived at mid-afternoon. Claire stood in the front hall with Mr. Thorne, watching as the guests descended. There were 3 couples, the Hendersons, the Carlyles, and the Ashworths. They were all dressed in the height of fashion, all carrying themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to being welcomed and accommodated. It was Mr. Ashworth who stepped forward first, a tall man with silver hair and an expression of keen intelligence. "Thorne," he said, extending his hand, "it's been far too long." "Indeed it has, Charles," Mr. Thorne replied. "I'm glad you could come. All of you. I want you to meet Miss Claire Hartwell, who has recently taken up the position of managing my household." Claire stepped forward and offered her hand, meeting each of their gazes in turn. She had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but the actual experience was far more intense than any practice session. She could feel their assessment, their scrutiny. She could sense the questions forming in their minds, but she did not falter. She greeted each of them with exactly the right measure of warmth and professionalism. She answered their initial inquiries about her background with the story that she and Mr. Thorne had developed, offering just enough information to satisfy without inviting further probing. And as they were led into the drawing room, newly furnished with the elegant curtains she had selected, she could see something shift in their expressions. This was not a woman of uncertain origins who had been impulsively added to a household. This was a woman who clearly belonged in a position of responsibility. This was a woman of capability and poise. The evening was spent in carefully orchestrated conversation. Mr. Thorne had prepared Claire for this as well, providing her with knowledge of the various business ventures and social concerns that his guests were likely to discuss. She was able to listen intelligently, to ask appropriate questions, to demonstrate that she was not simply ornamental but actually engaged with the world around her. It was during dinner, a meal that Claire had carefully planned with the kitchen staff, and that proceeded with flawless execution, that Mrs. Carlyle, an elegant woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for being difficult to please, turned to Claire with a smile that seemed almost genuine. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "I must tell you that your household has never looked better. And Miss Hartwell, you clearly have an excellent understanding of what makes a home function properly. It is a rare talent." It was a compliment, but it was also something more. It was validation. It was the kind of remark that, once uttered by someone like Mrs. Carlyle, would be repeated in drawing rooms throughout the city. It was the beginning of acceptance. But as the evening progressed, Claire became increasingly aware that not everyone was entirely satisfied. Mr. Henderson had asked several pointed questions about her family connections, questions that she had answered smoothly, but that suggested he was searching for some flaw in her story. And there was something in the way that Mrs. Ashworth watched her that suggested a deeper curiosity, not suspicion exactly, but a sense that there was more to Claire's story than what had been presented. It was late after the guests had retired to their rooms when Mr. Thorne found Claire in the morning room, where she had retreated to review the plans for the next day's activities. "You were extraordinary," he said. "Truly. Everything that I hoped for and more." "Thank you," Claire said, though I sensed that not everyone was entirely convinced. "Mr. Henderson is never entirely convinced of anything," Mr. Thorne said with a slight smile. "It is his nature to be skeptical, but his skepticism is not enough to undermine what you have demonstrated today. And Mrs. Ashworth," he paused, considering, "Mrs. Ashworth has simply recognized that you are more interesting than the simple narrative we have presented, which is perceptive of her, but also not necessarily a threat. And yet," Claire said carefully, "you seem troubled by something." Mr. Thorne moved to the window and stood looking out at the dark grounds beyond. "I have spent the last several weeks preparing you for this moment," he said, "preparing you to present yourself in a certain way, to construct a narrative that would be acceptable to people like the Hendersons and the Carlyles, and you have done that beautifully. But I find myself wondering," he turned back to face her, "whether I have done you a service by asking you to do so, or whether I have simply asked you to bury yourself more deeply under a false identity." Claire set down her pen and rose from her chair. "You gave me something that I have never had before," she said. "You gave me the possibility of a different life. You gave me the chance to be useful and valued. Whether the story I tell about my origins is technically true or not, it is true in the ways that matter. I have become someone different than I was when I arrived at this house. That is real." "Is it?" Mr. Thorne asked. "Or have you simply become a better actress at playing a role?" It was a question that Claire did not have a ready answer for. It was a question, she suspected, that Mr. Thorne himself was grappling with, a question that perhaps had more to do with his own struggles about identity and reinvention than with hers. "I suppose," she said finally, "that there is a point at which the role and the person become the same thing. I have been managing this household for 3 weeks. I have been making decisions and solving problems and working with the staff. That is not a role. That is my life, regardless of what story I tell about how I came to it." Mr. Thorne nodded slowly, as if accepting something that he had been resisting. "You are wise beyond your years," he said. "I think perhaps I brought you here not just because I needed someone to manage my household, but because I needed someone to help me understand how to live again, how to move forward from the past without pretending it didn't exist." The next few days proceeded with increasing smoothness. The guests were entertained with dinners and outings and long conversations. Claire moved through it all with growing confidence, no longer needing to consciously think about how she was presenting herself. The presentation had become natural. The role had become reality. It was on the third evening of their visit that something unexpected occurred. Claire was in the library, organizing some of the household records, when she heard raised voices from Mr. Thorne's study. She did not mean to eavesdrop, but the voices were loud enough that she could not help but hear fragments of conversation. "Surely you can see how this appears." That was Mr. Henderson. "I don't particularly care how it appears to you," Mr. Thorne's voice, sharp and angry. "My household is my own business." "Of course it is, but a woman of unknown origins, placed in such a position of authority, surely you understand that it invites speculation." The voices grew lower, but Claire heard enough. The validation of the past 3 days was fragile, the acceptance was conditional, and beneath it there remained the fundamental question: who was she, really? And did she truly belong in this world that had suddenly opened up to her? She was so caught up in these thoughts that she did not hear the footsteps approaching until Mr. Ashworth appeared in the library doorway. He was a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and his expression was unreadable. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all," Claire replied, rising from her seat. "I was simply organizing some papers." "Yes, so I see," he said, stepping into the room. "You know, I have known Mr. Thorne for a very long time, since we were both young men, in fact. And I have never seen him the way he has been since you arrived. There is a vitality to him that has been absent for years." Claire was not entirely certain what he was asking her to say. "Mr. Thorne has been very kind to me," she said carefully. "I am grateful for the opportunity he has given me." "Kindness," Mr. Ashworth said thoughtfully. "Yes, that would be one way to describe it. Though I wonder if there might be more to it than that. I wonder if perhaps Mr. Thorne sees something in you that goes beyond the professional skills that you clearly possess." "I'm not certain I understand what you mean," Claire said. "No, I suspect you don't," Mr. Ashworth said. "Or perhaps you understand it perfectly well but are simply unwilling to acknowledge it. Either way, I think you should know that you have made an impression here, not just on Mr. Thorne, but on all of us. The question is whether you are prepared for what that impression might lead to." He left the library before Claire could respond, leaving her standing among the ledgers and record books, her mind racing with questions she was not sure she wanted answered. That night Claire found herself unable to sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, Mr. Ashworth's words turning over and over in her mind like stones in a riverbed, each rotation revealing new surfaces, new angles, new implications she had not considered before. What impression had she made? And more importantly, what had Mr. Ashworth truly been trying to tell her? She thought back to the 3 days since the Hendersons' arrival. She had been so focused on performing her role correctly, on proving that she belonged in this position, that she had not allowed herself to notice the small moments. The way Mr. Thorne's gaze lingered on her when she spoke. The way his hand had touched her elbow as he guided her through a doorway, lingering a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. The way he had laughed, genuinely laughed, at something she had said during dinner, a sound that seemed to surprise even him. She had told herself these were merely the courtesies of a gentleman toward an employee. But Mr. Ashworth's words had stripped away that comfortable explanation, leaving her to confront something she had been carefully avoiding. The morning came gray and overcast, the sky pressing down like a lid on a box. Claire dressed with care, choosing her clothes with more deliberation than usual, then immediately felt foolish for doing so. She made her way downstairs and found that the household had already begun to stir. Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, was directing servants in the polishing of silver in the dining room. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. It was around mid-morning when Mr. Thorne emerged from his study. He looked tired, Claire thought. There were shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he, too, had not slept well. He saw her in the hallway and paused. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I wonder if you might have a moment. There is a matter I wish to discuss with you." Her heart performed an odd, uncertain rhythm in her chest. "Of course, sir." He gestured for her to follow him back into his study, a room she had been in only once or twice before. It was a space that reflected his character, lined with books, furnished with pieces that were clearly valuable but showed signs of long use rather than display. A large mahogany desk dominated one wall, its surface organized but not sterile. There was a lived-in quality to the room that was entirely absent from the more formal spaces in the house. Mr. Thorne closed the door behind them, which immediately heightened Claire's sense of anticipation. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned before his desk. She did so, arranging her skirts and placing her hands carefully in her lap, the posture of a woman waiting for judgment. Mr. Thorne did not sit immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the gray morning. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. "I believe you overheard a portion of my conversation with Mr. Henderson yesterday," he said. It was not a question. Claire felt her face warm. "I apologize, sir. I did not mean to." "I am not addressing you as though you have committed some transgression," Mr. Thorne said, turning from the window. "I am merely stating a fact, and I think it is important that you understand what that conversation was truly about." He moved to sit behind his desk, though he did not settle back into his chair in the manner of a man asserting authority. Instead, he perched on the edge of it, closer to her than the furniture would typically suggest. "Mr. Henderson came to me with concerns," Mr. Thorne continued. "Not about your competence. He has seen enough of your work to know that you are more than capable. His concerns were of a more personal nature. He feels that the arrangement I have made with you, bringing you into this household in such a prominent role, might invite certain kinds of speculation, particularly given the fact that you are an unmarried woman, and I am an unmarried man." The words hung in the air between them. Claire's mind raced through their implications. "I understand," she said carefully. "I suppose such concerns are not entirely unreasonable." "Are they not?" Mr. Thorne asked, and there was something in his expression that suggested this was not a rhetorical question. "I have given it considerable thought, and I have concluded that Mr. Henderson's concerns, while perhaps understandable from a certain perspective, are ultimately irrelevant to the matter at hand." "Irrelevant?" Claire echoed. "Yes," Mr. Thorne said. "Because the truth is, Miss Hartwell, that I brought you into this household not merely because you were qualified for the position. Though you are remarkably qualified. I brought you here because I saw in you something that I had believed was lost to me, and I still want, to know what that something might become." He paused, and in that pause, Claire felt the ground beneath her certainties shift. "I am going to tell you something now," Mr. Thorne said, "and I ask that you listen without interruption until I have finished. Can you do that?" Claire nodded, though she was not entirely certain her voice would work if she attempted to use it. "When I was a young man," Mr. Thorne began, "I was very much like any other young man of my class. I had certain expectations placed upon me. I was groomed to take over my father's business interests. I was expected to marry a woman from an appropriate family, produce an heir, and generally live according to a prescribed set of rules and expectations. For some years, I did precisely that. I attempted to fulfill every expectation placed upon me. He rose from the desk and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "And then my wife died," he said simply. 12 years ago now. She died in childbirth along with the child, and something in me died with her. Not because I had loved her. I had cared for her, certainly, as one might care for a respected colleague, but not with the kind of love that poets write about. Not with the kind of passion that makes one feel truly alive. He looked at Claire, and in his eyes was a vulnerability that surprised her. "After her death," he continued, "I withdrew. I told myself that this was the appropriate response to grief. I buried myself in my work. I became, as I suspect you may have observed, something of a hermit, and I convinced myself that this was sufficient. That a man of my age, having already experienced marriage, had no right to expect anything more from life. That passion and vitality were the province of the young, and I had forfeited my claim to them." He returned to his position at the desk, but this time he sat in the chair behind it, creating a more formal distance between them. "Then you arrived," he said, "and everything I had convinced myself about the arc of my life, about what was possible and what was not, began to crumble." Claire found her voice. "Mr. Thorne, I am not certain what you are asking of me, or what you expect me to. I am asking you," he said, interrupting gently, "to understand the situation as it truly is, rather than as you believe it should be. I am asking you to consider whether your presence here is merely a matter of professional convenience, or whether there might be something more at stake." "But I was sold," Claire said, the words emerging before she could stop them. "I was sold by my family to pay their debts. How can you ignore that? How can you look at me and not see what that means about my circumstances, my origins, my—" "How can I not see it, Mr. Thorne said, and his voice was sharp now, cutting through her rising panic. "I see it perfectly well. I see a woman who was failed by every person who should have protected her. I see a woman who was treated as a commodity rather than a human being. And I also see a woman who, despite all of that, rose above those circumstances. You did not remain a victim, Miss Hartwell. You took the opportunity I offered you, and you transformed yourself. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to be honored. But your neighbors—" "Let them speculate," Mr. Thorne said. "Let them whisper in their drawing rooms about what might or might not be occurring in my household. I have spent the last 12 years living according to their expectations, and I have found that path to be a hollow one. I am not willing to spend the remainder of my life doing the same." There was a knock at the study door. Both Claire and Mr. Thorne turned toward the sound, and the moment fractured like glass. Mr. Thorne rose and called out permission to enter. It was Mrs. Chen, looking apologetic. "Forgive the interruption, sir, but there is a matter in the kitchen that requires your attention. The provisions delivery has been damaged in transit, and cook is uncertain what can be salvaged." Mr. Thorne glanced at Claire, and she saw something flash across his face. Frustration, resignation, something else she could not quite name. "I will be there momentarily," he said to Mrs. Chen, who bobbed her head and withdrew. He turned back to Claire. "This conversation is not finished," he said, "but circumstances, it seems, have other ideas. I would ask that you think about what I have told you, not with judgment, not with fear, simply with an open mind." Claire rose from her chair on unsteady legs. "Of course, sir." She left the study before he could say anything more, her thoughts in such turmoil that she scarcely noticed where her feet were taking her. She found herself in the library again, that room which had become something of a refuge for her in this house. She sat at the table where she had been organizing records the day before and pressed her hands to her face. What was happening? What was Mr. Thorne truly offering her? And more pressingly, what was she prepared to accept? The afternoon passed in a state of distraction. Claire attempted to return to her work, but the figures and entries that had seemed so clear and logical before now swam before her eyes without forming coherent patterns. She found herself reading the same line multiple times without comprehending a single word. It was late in the afternoon when she became aware that she was no longer alone. She looked up to find Mr. Ashworth standing in the doorway of the library. "I took the liberty of asking a servant where you might be," he said, stepping into the room. "I hoped we might continue our conversation from yesterday. I fear I was rather cryptic, and I suspect Mr. Thorne may have been more direct this morning than was altogether helpful." "How did you?" Claire began. "The expression on both of your faces when you emerged from his study just before luncheon was rather illuminating," Mr. Ashworth said. He did not sit, but he did move closer, leaning against the edge of the nearest table. "I take it he has made his intentions known." "His intentions are unclear to me," Claire said carefully. "Yes, well, that would be the fault of Mr. Thorne's approach rather than any deficiency on your part," Mr. Ashworth said. "He is a man who tends toward the philosophical and abstract when what the situation probably requires is considerably more directness." He paused. "I am going to speak to you now not as a guest in this house, but as someone who cares very genuinely about what happens to Mr. Thorne. Can you accept that?" Claire nodded slowly. "Mr. Thorne is a good man," Mr. Ashworth said, "but he is also a man who has spent the better part of 12 years hiding from life. His marriage was, by all accounts, amiable but passionless. His wife's death, while genuinely sorrowful, did not wound him in the way that such a loss might wound someone who had loved more deeply. What has happened since her passing is that he has constructed a world in which passion itself is understood as something dangerous, something best avoided. He has convinced himself that the quiet life is the appropriate life for a man in his position." "And what do you believe?" Claire asked. "I believe," Mr. Ashworth said, "that a man who has experienced true passion, who has felt truly alive, can never again convince himself that a quiet, passionless existence is sufficient. I believe that Mr. Thorne looked at you and felt something waken in him that he had thought was dead. And I believe that terrifies him, because he does not know what to do with that feeling. He cannot expect me to reciprocate feelings that I may not share," Claire said, the words sounding defensive even to her own ears. "No," Mr. Ashworth agreed. "He cannot, and I do not believe that he is expecting you to do so. What I believe he is hoping for is the possibility that such feelings might develop over time, that you might allow yourself to be in his company without the armor of professional propriety, that you might allow him to know you as something other than an employee." "That is naive," Claire said. "The circumstances of my life make it impossible." "Do they?" Mr. Ashworth interrupted. "I wonder if what you mean is that you yourself find it impossible to imagine a future in which those circumstances do not define you. There is a significant difference." Before Claire could respond, Mr. Ashworth straightened from the table. "I will leave you to your thoughts," he said. "But I will say this. Mr. Thorne is a man of considerable integrity. Whatever feelings he may have developed toward you, they do not stem from a desire to exploit or control. He is offering you something that very few women in your situation are ever offered: a choice, a genuine choice about the direction of your own life. I would encourage you to consider very carefully what it is that you truly want, rather than what you believe you ought to want." He left the library, and Claire was alone once more with the ledgers and record books and the sound of the wind against the windows. The evening meal was an intense affair. The Hendersons were still in residence, and their presence seemed to emphasize all of the unspoken tensions in the room. Mr. Henderson made several pointed remarks about the importance of maintaining appropriate social conventions. His wife offered Claire cool smiles that did not reach her eyes, and Mr. Thorne, for his part, was impeccably polite to everyone, though Claire noticed that he did not attempt to engage her in conversation, maintaining instead a careful distance that felt somehow more intimate than closeness could have been. After the meal, the party retired to the drawing room. There was to be music. One of Mrs. Henderson's daughters played the pianoforte with a technical precision that was entirely lacking in feeling. As Claire listened, she found her mind drifting to the events of the day, To Mr. Thorne's confession, to Mr. Ashworth's words. What did she want? It was a question she had scarcely allowed herself to ask in the context of her own life. For so long, her wants had been subordinate to the wants of others. Her family's need for money, the man to whom she had been sold and his needs. Now, Mr. Thorne was offering her something unprecedented, the opportunity to want, to choose, to direct her own path. But what if she wanted the wrong thing? What if she allowed herself to feel something that could not be sustained? What if she placed her trust in Mr. Thorne only to discover that his interest in her was as temporary as the interests of the other men she had encountered? These were the questions that plagued her as she sat in the drawing room, watching Mrs. Henderson's daughter massacre a Chopin nocturne with her precise, uninspired fingers. It was well past midnight when Claire finally retired to her room. She had expected to lie awake again, her mind churning. Instead, exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, and she fell into a sleep that was deep and dreamless. She woke to the sound of urgent voices in the hallway outside her door. For a moment she lay in bed, uncertain whether she had truly heard anything or whether the sounds belonged to a dream. But then there came a sharp knock on her door, and before she could respond, Mrs. Chen's voice came from the other side. Miss Hartwell, are you awake?" Claire rose quickly, pulling her dressing gown around herself. "One moment," she called, and then opened the door to find Mrs. Chen looking visibly distressed. "What has happened?" Claire asked. "It is Mr. Thorne," Mrs. Chen said. "He has taken ill. We fear it may be quite serious. He is asking for you." Claire's heart seemed to stop. "For me?" "Yes. He woke not more than an hour ago, burning with fever, complaining of a terrible pain in his chest. The doctor has been sent for, but he has not yet arrived. Mr. Thorne is insisting that you be brought to him. I understand this is irregular, but given the circumstances." "Of course," Claire said, already moving toward the hallway. "Show me to his room." She followed Mrs. Chen up a narrow staircase and down a corridor she had never traversed before. The household, which had been so orderly and controlled, now seemed to exist in a state of controlled chaos. Servants moved back and forth with basins of water and clean linens. The sound of Mr. Thorne's labored breathing could be heard even from the hallway. His bedchamber was a large, masculine space dominated by a four-poster bed in which he now lay, his face flushed with fever. A servant was attempting to apply cool compresses to his forehead, but he was restless, turning his head from side to side. "Leave us," he said when he saw Claire enter, his voice hoarse. The servant looked uncertain, but a gesture from Mrs. Chen sent her from the room. "Mr. Thorne," Claire said, moving to the bedside, "you should not exert yourself. You need rest." "I need," he began, then paused as if gathering strength. "I need you to understand. Before the fever takes my clarity, I need you to know that this is not a trick, that this is not manipulation, that I am asking you for nothing but honesty." "You are not well," Claire said. "These are not conversations we should be having now." "They are precisely the conversations we should be having now," Mr. Thorne said with surprising force. "Because illness has a way of clarifying what matters. And what matters to me is that you know the truth, the whole truth." He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he opened them again, there was a clarity in them that seemed at odds with the fever that consumed him. "I brought you here," he said slowly, "not as an act of charity. I brought you here because I saw in you something that reminded me of the person I once was, before loss, before fear, before I convinced myself that safety was more important than vitality." He paused, breathing heavily. "And over these past days, I have come to care for you in a way that transcends professional consideration or even the affection one might feel for a valued friend. I am telling you this now in this state, so that you will know it is true. Because a man does not confess such things while his mind is clouded by fever, unless they are among the most important truths he possesses." Claire felt tears threatening, though she could not have said exactly why. "Mr. Thorne, I do not expect you to return these feelings," he continued. That would be naive and unfair. But I do expect you to consider the possibility that there might be a future in which your circumstances do not define your options, in which you are free to choose, not between accepting or rejecting what has been offered, but between the various possibilities that genuine freedom might present. Before Claire could respond, a coughing fit seized him, harsh and racking. She poured water from the pitcher on the bedside table and held the glass to his lips. He drank, then fell back against the pillows, exhausted by the effort. "The doctor will be here soon," Claire said. "You must rest now." "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice now barely more than a whisper. She hesitated for only a moment. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." She sat in the chair beside his bed, watching as fever and exhaustion pulled him into an uneasy sleep. Outside, the night continued its slow passage toward dawn, and Claire found herself confronting, in the quiet hours of that long night, questions that she could no longer avoid.